let's be realistic about that. And I prided myself on my ability to reason basic causes. And I understood that people are more often governed by their emotions than they are by rational thought. In fact, I said, government is necessary because the passions of man will not conform to the dictates of reason and justice without constraint. That's why we had that Constitution and the new government, because the passions of men will not conform to the dictates of reason and justice without constraint. Passions, womanish decision-making, we could ill afford it. Our goal as a young nation was to survive, not to involve ourselves in foreign wars, but to survive and to become strong enough so that in time we could defend ourselves against any possible invader. And I like to think that the America that you live in today is the inheritor of that vision. John Adams was a disaster. He threw tantrums. He yelled and screamed at his advisors. His cabinet despised him, and he would not take their advice. I wrote, the ablest person can profit from advice. What manner of man does Mr. Adams think that he is that he does not need it? And my goodness, he did need it. But that document appeared on the scenes late. It was written to my intimate friends, and as I understand it, Aaron Burr intercepted a copy of it, and in the service of the Democratic Republican ticket, reprinted it and distributed it as widely as possible. Is that true, Mr. Jefferson? That it was Colonel Burr, your associate?
He is said to have played a role in that, yes.
Okay. Well, that's the story behind the pamphlet. I was deemed insane for doing that. I also was believed to be insane for showing up at a duel when I had no intention of firing at my opponent, Colonel Burr. But I must tell you, I believed in truth, and I believed in honor. And I thought the truth had to be spoken to the people of the United States through their representatives that I knew, that John Adams was entirely unfit for the office of president. A man who throws himself into frenzies and rages and treats others with absolute disrespect should not ever occupy the Oval Office.
I never thought I would be in the position of needing now to defend John Adams. John Adams had a chance to fight a war with France in 1798 or 1799, and at first he was so offended by something called the XYZ affair that he asked Congress to have measures for a provisional army and defense measures and so on. And then it seemed that time went by and we were getting mixed signals from the French Directory, and finally Adams thought, instead of continuing down this path of war preparation, which was becoming highly unpopular because it was heavy taxation and because of the manner in which that provisional army was being administered, he decided to send this extraordinary second mission off to France, and he did so somewhat secretly. He didn't consult his cabinet. He just announced it. Some changes were made. Instead of one person going, three went, and they were able to conclude a peace settlement with the Directory. And as you know, John Adams later in his life said that he wanted to be remembered in history as the man who had the courage to send that second diplomatic mission to France, that of all the things that he ever did, that this is the one that he was most proud of because he had taken the extra measure for diplomacy and secured peace rather than descending into war. I regard that as a remarkable achievement, however much it may have offended others. So I'm going to defend Adams for doing that because peace should be our passion, and we should always make sure that war is the very, very last lamentable outcome of diplomacy that breaks down.
Indeed.
And nothing in Adams' life gave me more pride in my friendship with him than that act of statesmanship, because that too cost him re-election as president in 1800. So you wanted to talk about vision. Let us do that. Mr. Hamilton said at the end of his life, and he quoted it tonight, that the Constitution was, quote, a shilly-shally thing, a thing of milk and water, a frail and worthless fabric. I don't see it that way at all. Now, I should say, I was not at the Constitutional Convention in 1787. Alexander Hamilton was. I was serving as the American minister to the court of Louis XVI, so that I was in France, and so I was not a member of the 55-member delegation that met between May and September of 1787. I was fascinated by this. Here we were, frustrated with the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, now gathering to write a completely new constitution equal to the emerging dynamics of American life. And here were the most extraordinary men of America, 55 of them, including my closest friend Madison, but the great Washington, Dr. Franklin was there. This was an assembly of luminaries. And they had a closed-door protocol that everything that happened within the convention hall was a secret and would not be promulgated to the world, lest there be unnecessary interference from the outside. And so I watched from Paris with extraordinary fascination to see what would emerge. And when they finally finished in September of 1787, 3 members of the Constitutional Convention sent me drafts of the new Constitution. My closest friend Madison, the president of the convention, George Washington, and Dr. Franklin. When I read these, I was surprised and very concerned about how strong the new Constitution was. I liked what I called the good old venerable fabric of the Articles of Confederation. Under the Articles of Confederation, each state was a sovereign nation. So Massachusetts was a nation, and Virginia was a nation, and New Hampshire was a nation, and they had come together in a limited confederacy to do certain national and international things. But in all domestic concerns, Virginia remained a sovereign commonwealth. I believe in that. I prefer that to what replaced it. The new Constitution has too much central authority. It gathers up the power and sovereignty of the country into one head. And if it were that powerful in 1787, I figured, it could only grow more powerful and more powerful still in the course of American history. I said, this is like bringing in a fox to police the hen house. And so I worried that this instrument was far too strong. And then if you add to that, now it's been ratified by 12 of the 13 states, including, reluctantly, Virginia. Almost the minute the first administration began, Mr. Hamilton was the Secretary of the Treasury. He's putting our finances in order. He decides that the only way to make this work is to have a national bank of the United States. Now, we can agree or disagree about whether a national bank is a good idea. I happen to think it's a disastrous idea, but that's not my point here. When the Founding Fathers created Article 1 of the Constitution, enumerating the powers of Congress, they gave power the right to coin money, to levy taxes, to draft troops, to engage in diplomacy. There's a long list of enumerated powers that our government can undertake through Congress. It's very thorough. And none of those enumerated powers said a national bank of the United States. Do you understand this? Our security is in having a written constitution that draws a line around power and prevents it from moving in dangerous directions in a self-created way. You enumerate the powers of government to limit the capacity of government to control our lives. And so now we're 2 or 3 years into our national experiment, and Hamilton wants a national bank. If he really wants a national bank, the remedy is to go to the people and say, we didn't think of this at the Constitutional Convention. We now believe that it's important, even essential. But the only way to make it legitimate is to turn back to you, the sovereign, and ask you to amend that Constitution to enable us to do something we now regard as essential but wasn't included in the thing that you ratified. That's the proper mechanism, to return to the sovereign. But that's not what Mr. Hamilton wanted to do. He wrote a famous paper to George Washington, and he said, well, we don't have to amend the Constitution to enable the National Bank of the United States, even though it's not enumerated by the Founding Fathers. He said, it's implied. It's implied in the Constitution. And when he was asked how, he said, well, in the preamble, there's something called the General Welfare Clause. And he said, that implies a bank. And then at the end of the Constitution, there's something called the Necessary and Proper Clause, that the government has the right to do what is necessary and proper to implement the enumerated powers. And he said, there's your national bank. Well, I'm a strict constructionist. I believe that our security is in having a written constitution that tells us exactly what government can do and exactly what it cannot do. And once you step beyond that boundary, you've entered a field of boundless abusiveness no longer capable of any restraint. I said, if you're going to have implied powers, you may as well write your Constitution on wax and stretch it into any shape that pleases you from moment to moment. Washington agreed with Alexander Hamilton, and the National Bank of the United States was born. So not only was the Constitution that was drafted in Philadelphia enormously strong and centralized, erosive of states' rights, but almost before it got started, thanks to Mr. Hamilton, we added the doctrine of implied powers, which says that government can more or less do whatever it wants to do if it's for the general welfare of the United States. I regard that as effectively nullifying our security in having a written constitution.
Let us suppose that we form a republic. You elect certain of us to be your officials, and you tell us that we can go bring your vision into reality, but only if we continue to return to you to get your permission. That's what Mr. Jefferson is saying. I believe that sovereignty shifted from the state to the federal government with the ratification of the Constitution by the states. It shifted insofar as now it was not the responsibility of Virginia or Massachusetts to decide what was the best policy for it. It was the responsibility of the federal government, which was not made up only of plutocrats from New York, but from people in each and every state. I said there are many things. There are many things that a government is allowed to do. There are certainly other things that it's not permitted to do. But there is a great deal of ground in the middle over which men of good conscience and virtue can disagree. And this is one of those areas. I would like to add a couple of little postscripts by way of our conversation here. When Mr. Madison was President of the United States, the charter of the National Bank was renewed. And when Mr. Jefferson was President of the United States, this strict constructionist purchased Louisiana, which was a wonderful thing for